Well, hey, what's up, Hope City Church? How's everybody doing this morning? You guys doing good? Come on, make a little bit of noise if you're awake. You got your caffeine in you. Come on, somebody. Hey, my name's Justin. I'm the youth pastor here at Hope City Church. And first and foremost, I just want you to know that I'm really glad you're here, because if you weren't, this would be kind of awkward, right? I'd just be preaching to some empty chairs. Today, I get to close out our series at the movies. Anybody had fun during At the Movies? Man, I don't know about you, but for me, it's been so neat to just pull out the biblical truth that we find in some of our favorite films. We've been through some movies like Into the Spider-Verse, right? It's a good movie. Instant Family makes me cry instantly, like all the time. Mary Poppins Returns last week, and then this week I get the privilege of teaching just kind of the biblical truths found in Avengers Endgame. If you missed any of those messages, go find the podcast, because they were so good. Do we have any Avenger fans in the room? Show of hands. Right now, wherever you're at, wherever you're sitting, I want you to just shout at me, not too aggressively, but just let me know, who is your favorite Avenger right now? Just Spider-Man, Captain America. Sorry, Jason Momoa is not an Avenger. All right. Okay. Anybody like Captain America? Just give me a ooh if you like Captain America. Captain America, man, he is number one. He's one of the leaders. I would argue there's two leaders of the Avengers. I would say it's Iron Man and Captain America. But Captain America, just for today, let's call him the leader of the Avengers, right? I mean, he's the epitome of what a leader is supposed to be. I mean, he stands for something, right? And he is unshaken, right? He does not bend. He knows what he stands for. I look at Captain America, man, this guy leads with courage, right? He doesn't back down from a challenge. He leads with compassion. He's got a heart, right, for those that are suffering, and he leads with conviction. He knows what he believes. And so what I want to do this morning, before we even dive into the message, is I actually just want to stop, and I want to honor my leader and my pastor, Pastor Peter Goweski. Can we just give it up for him real quick? I've had a front row seat over the past year to his leadership. And his biceps might be a little bit smaller, and he may have a little bit less hair than Captain America, but I'll tell you this, he leads with courage, he leads with compassion, he leads with conviction. And Peter, I really just want to say that I wouldn't have the opportunity to be here right now preaching to Hope City Church if it weren't for you having the courage 3 years ago in 2017 to plant this church. I want to thank you for being a selfless leader. Thank you for giving the pulpit right here to a 25-year-old punk that wears bright colors, man. Skinny jeans are too tight. Seriously, thank you for believing in me. I love you. Our church loves you. I got you a gift. It's a Captain America action figure. Just to say thank you. I love you, man. Yeah, I love you, man. His butt's not as nice as Captain America's. Just kidding. I've never looked at it. Avengers Endgame. It's the final installment of an 11-year, 20-film cinematic universe. Literally every single movie over the past 11 years has led up to this one. This movie is an absolute phenomenon. I mean, there has never been a superhero movie like this one. In fact, right now, it's on track to breaking Avatar's world record for the highest grossing movie of all time, which is like $2.7 billion. That's absolutely insane. But if you've never heard of the Avengers, you've never watched any of the movies, let me catch you up on the synopsis of this movie. Avengers Endgame is set after Thanos. He's a supervillain. He collects these things called the Infinity Stones. He puts them in like this thing called the Infinity Gauntlet. And he uses it to wipe out over half of the Earth's population. right? And that happens in Infinity War. And those left behind are desperate to do something. I mean, absolutely anything to bring back the loved ones that they lost. But after an initial attempt creates more problems than solutions, the grieving, purposeless Avengers think all hope is lost. But they're re-energized when Ant-Man, like I didn't even watch that movie, like this guy of all guys, comes to the scene and he's like, hey, I got a plan. And so all of a sudden there's a spark of hope. And they're like, hey, we're going to do whatever it takes. It's a life or death mission. We're going to do whatever it takes. We got to go get back what we lost. We have to, if whatever it takes, we've got to defeat Thanos. And so before we dive into the message this morning, I'd love for us to just watch the trailer together. Check it out on the side screens.
God, seems like 1,000 years ago. I fought my way out of that cave, became Iron Man. Realized I loved you. I know I said no more surprises, but I was really hoping to pull off one last one.
The world has changed. None of us can go back. All we can do is our best. And sometimes the best that we can do is to start over.
I saw all these people die. I keep telling everybody they should move on. Some do, but not us.
Even if there's a small chance, we owe this to everyone who's not in this room to try.
We will. Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes. I like this one.
Wow, how good is that? Come on, whatever it takes. Whatever it takes. Here's the thing. We're so used to seeing the superheroes come out on top, right? That they always find a way to dig deep, even when the odds are stacked against them, right? They find a way to dig deep and come out victorious. Except that's not how this story goes. Despite giving it everything they absolutely have, in the end, Thanos succeeds. He wipes out 50% of the population. They lose. Another way to say it is they fail. You see, the reason why Endgame is unlike any other superhero movie ever made is because it actually starts at the point of failure. How many of you know failure is all over the place, isn't it? It's all over the place. I'll never forget. I'll never forget. Amanda and I were dating. Amanda's my wife. We were maybe together about 1.5 years, and I get on the phone and I call her and I'm like, hey, boo, I want you to get ready because we're going out tonight. And we live in large. We're going to Applebee's. How many of y'all know that when you're 19 and broke, Applebee's is like Rodizio Grill? Come on, like it's Daruma tonight, right? Like we're going to Applebee's, and so we sit down at Applebee's, and I'm like, whatever you want, babe. Splurge. No budget. We eat our meal, and it's Applebee's, right? And the server comes and she drops off the check. I give her the debit card. And a few minutes later, she comes back and she's got like this really concerned look on her face. And she does that thing, you know, we've seen we've all seen this. I know we have, where she's like, "Sir, I'm sorry, but your card has declined." And I'm like, "Oh, that's odd." So I get on my mobile banking app and I look. Y'all, I don't have enough money in my bank to pay the bill. Can I tell you how much of a failure I felt like in that moment? I took this girl on a date and I couldn't even pay for it. And yet somehow I still got her to marry me. Come on. Let's go, whatever it takes. Now whenever we go to Applebee's, I'll be like, "Hey, remember that one time?" And then she's just like, "I'll kill you. You want to die? Because you will." You can have $1,000 in the bank, but if your card declines, there's something in you that panics a little bit, right? Because the truth is, nobody likes it when their card fails. It's a little bit too close for comfort, right? For me, it wasn't that my card failed. It was actually that I felt like a failure. Maybe you've never found yourself with a food bill you couldn't pay like I have, but I know that every single one of us in here this morning has experienced failure in your life. Because failure is universal. We all go through it. But it may look different for each and every single one of us. Maybe you're here this morning and you've got some relationships in your life that have failed. You've got siblings that you haven't talked to in years. Or maybe your marriage is on the rocks and literally the only thing keeping it together right now are the kids. Except you come to church and you fake it because you feel guilt and you feel shame and regret. You know, for whatever reason, you're like, "I'm giving it everything I've got, full on effort." But the relationships in my life, they're broken, they're fragmented. And if you were to be honest with yourself, you would say, "I feel like a failure." Maybe you're an entrepreneur, and over the years you've invested money in businesses, and they just ended up failing in the long run. And as of right now, you're on like your second or third business, and you're praying to God that this one works, because if it doesn't, you have no idea what you're going to do next. And if you were to be honest, you'd admit that you wonder sometimes if those businesses, if your finances aren't failing because you're a failure. Like it's failing because I'm a failure. Teenagers, look at me. Have you ever felt like no matter how hard you try, you can never seem to live up to your parents' expectations? Right? Like despite giving that class everything you had, you still ended up getting a C. And a C doesn't fail the class, but you know that a C fails your parents. Because you know that in your household, C's aren't acceptable. That's not how your family rolls. And so deep down inside, you feel like a failure. Here's the deal. Failure is universal. It's been around forever. And so what I want to do this morning is I want to take a look at someone who was a superhero in their time, but experienced a great failure. We're going to be camping out in Acts chapter 9. We're going to be looking at one of the most famous failures in history. And I believe there's so much that we can learn from failure in this story. And so we're just going to dive right in. Are you guys ready? If you're ready, say yeah. All right, we're going to be in page 750 in your Bibles. You go ahead and turn there. I'll give you a second. Page 750, Acts chapter 9, one of the most famous failures in history. You can also follow along on the screens. Acts 9, verse 1 through 2. It says this. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. Context. In the chapter right before this one, we find Saul going around wiping out Christians like he's Thanos with the Infinity Gauntlet. And as a result of the persecution, these Christians, they begin to scatter in all these different nearby cities. And one of those cities just so happens to be Damascus. And so Saul gets word, from like the raven, right? The raven comes in and I don't know. He gets word somehow that they're in Damascus. And so he goes to the Sanhedrin, he goes to the high priest, and he gets permission to go on a mission to go to Damascus and extradite, remove these Christians that are hiding in the city of Damascus. He's on a mission to snap them away. And so often we think of Paul and we forget about Saul. We love to honor and talk about Paul. I mean, he's this biblical superhero. He's the biblical Iron Man, right? The biblical Tony Stark. But nobody ever wants to talk about Saul. We don't celebrate, we don't honor Saul. Because Saul wasn't a biblical superhero, he was a biblical supervillain. Saul was the equivalent to Thanos. But something happens to Saul on his way to Damascus. Let's take a look. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." The men traveling with Saul stood there, speechless. They heard the sound, but they didn't see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind. He did not eat or drink anything. In the midst of his most zealous act yet, Saul falls flat on his face. He sets out on a mission to wreak havoc on Christians hiding in Damascus, but he fails. But even worse than that, not only does he fail his mission, but he actually finds out that this entire time he's been failing God. The entire reason why he was persecuting Christians in the first place is because he believed that they were a threat to the religion of Judaism, right? He's like, listen, I am religious. I'm the top of the top. And these guys, this isn't right. And so he's trying to take them out because he's a religious man. Now I want you to put yourself in Saul's shoes for a minute, right? Let's tap into our imagination. Can you imagine what was going through his mind as the voice of Jesus thundered down on him? Imagine the shame and the guilt that came over him as he had the realization that his sin was a part of the reason why Jesus was crucified. That moment when he realized that he completely missed it and that Jesus was exactly who he claimed to be. Imagine how much of a failure that he felt like when he had to be led by the hand, like a parent does their child when they're crossing the road into Damascus. Come on, Saul, you can do it. One step after the next, hold my hand. Can you imagine? Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Mr. Pharisee of Pharisees. Talk about poetic. Talk about failure. First thing we learn from Saul is this. Write this down if you're taking notes. Failure is for certain. I don't know if anybody's ever told you this, but you're going to fail. You probably already knew that already because you've already failed. Failure is for certain. My favorite Avenger by far has to be Thor. I love Thor. There's just something just with Thor that resonates with me. I love him. But in Endgame, he's one of the Avengers that takes their failure the hardest. And so at one point, they're going around and they're trying to assemble all of the Avengers to get them back together for this last-ditch effort, right, to whatever it takes. But when they find Thor, they find him and he looks like this. Now, I'm going to tell you, like straight up, this is one of my favorite parts of the movie. And I'm going to tell you why. Because number one, I feel represented. Right, it's about, I'm tired of these six-pack, big bicep having superheroes. We need some superheroes with some XL dad bods. You know what I'm saying? I feel represented. Thank you, Thor. But number two, it's so real. It's one of those ways that people respond to failure. And it doesn't just get better from there for him. Because later in the movie, he's still wrestling with his failure. He doesn't know how to accept the fact that he's failed. He's got guilt. He's got shame. He has regret. And he has this conversation with his mom that changes everything. And in this conversation, he says, Mom, I just feel like such an idiot. And she goes, no, son, you're not an idiot, but you are a failure. And he's like, that's kind of harsh. And then she asks him this question. She says, do you know what that makes you? Just like everyone else. And then the God of thunder, he goes, I'm not supposed to be like everyone else. And then she says something that just rocks his world. She goes, we all fail at who we're supposed to be. And when I heard that, I was like, ooh, that'll preach. Ooh, I'm going to get that in a message somehow. That'll preach. Here's the truth. Failure is for certain. The Avengers failed. Saul failed. I fail. You fail. It's not a matter of if it happens. It's a matter of when it happens. And I know this doesn't get you fired up. I know this isn't encouraging because there's nobody in here this morning that just when somebody talks about failure, you're like, oh, yeah. Come on, somebody. I'm going to fail. I'm going to fail. I'm going to fail. Nobody does that. We don't like to fail. But I got good news for you. The good news is this. Failure is for certain. Second point, write this down. But failure is not final. Now, I'm not on a soapbox up here. I am by no means perfect. I don't have this thing all figured out. I fail just as much as the next person does. In fact, a few months ago, I had a failure that cut me to my core. You ever had a failure that it just hurts a little bit? You're like, oh, that one, I just have a little bit of time like that just to get over it and get past it. So Peter and I had this meeting a few months ago that really didn't go all that great. It's one of those meetings that you just know isn't going to be rainbows and unicorns, right? When the meeting gets set up, you're like, oh man, you just get that feel, that sinking feeling in your stomach. I'm going to hit pause real quick. Just a little Justin fun fact. Please, I beg you, don't ever send me a text and say, hey, we need to talk, without telling me what the topic is about, because you're going to give me a stomach ulcer, okay? I don't need a stomach ulcer, right? So I sit down, and I've got stomach ulcers now, right? Like just indigestion, right? And the very, and I don't know if this was the first thing he said. I'm going to be honest with you, but it's like the only thing I remember. I sit down, and he's like, obviously, this isn't going to be the most fun conversation we've ever had. You know when you start to get queasy, you feel like you're going to throw up? It's like, should I have eaten before this meeting? Right? Like all that came over me like right in that moment. I'm like, 1 second, let me go barf because I didn't really barf. I'm kidding. A little bit of background from January to March. We just had a little bit of a rough time in Hope City Youth. And the issue was, instead of reaching out to Peter for help, I just dug my heels into the ground. Some of you might relate to this, but I just have this really bad tendency to just try to tough stuff out. And so I dug my heels into the ground, and I just tried to power through it. But the issue was I wasn't changing my approach, right? It's like I'm just going to keep doing the same thing, right? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And so I'm just going to keep doing this. I'm just keep grinding. And so over the course of the meeting, I did everything I could to hold back my tears. Listen, I'll own it. I'm an emotional man, all right? And so I'm sitting there, I'm like, I'm not going to cry. I'm a man, right? But finally, I just broke because I couldn't really hold it in anymore. And finally, I just said to Peter, I said, I didn't want to come to you because I felt like such a failure. I thought that if I just buckled down and tried harder, then maybe things would look up. But no matter how hard I've tried, nothing has worked. And if we're being honest, I just feel like a bad youth pastor. And in that meeting, I had to humble myself and I had to admit that I needed help. And together, him and I, we created a plan to re-engage the students that had been MIA. And I left there with a plan of action. I was like, you know what, whatever it takes, right? But can I be real with you guys? Failure was hard for me to handle. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever just wanted to throw in the towel and call it quits, hang up your hat and go home? I tell you what, I got on the phone and I called up a close friend of mine up in Michigan, and he got on the phone and I'm like, I can't do this. And he goes, shut up. Yes, you can. You were made for this. Listen, we need people in our lives that are going to champion us and encourage us when we're down and out. We need somebody to just tell us, shut up. Come on. Let's go. You can do it. God has a plan for you. Do you have somebody like that in your life? Because if you don't, I need you to find someone. We're not meant to do this thing alone. We need people. We need a squad, right? Right, HCY? We need a squad. We need people, right? Here's what I know. I know that what we do with our failure matters. I believe that some of the most important moments in our lives are what we decide to do after we fail. Stay with me here. The way I see it, there's failure and defeat, and then there's failure and victory. And every single one of us are somewhere in between. You see, after Saul's failure, there were 3 days where he was laid up blind. And what he did between his failure and that third day is the reason he came out on the other side as the person that we know as Paul. Right? Look at what Scripture says. It says this: in Damascus, there was a disciple named Ananias. The Lord called to him in a vision, "Ananias." "Yes, Lord," he answered. The Lord told him, "Go to the house of Judas on Straight Street and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, for he is praying. In a vision, he has seen a man named Ananias come and place his hands on him to restore his sight." Paul took his failures and he laid them down at the feet of Jesus. He didn't come up with a new strategy. He didn't make a list of things that he was going to do better. Hear me today. When he was in between his failure and whatever was next, Saul was in prayer. Listen, after our failure, the thing we need to do more than anything else is pray. We just need to get on our knees and say, "God, I messed up. God, I need you." And while Saul was in prayer, God airdropped him a fresh vision for his life. And because of that, his failure wasn't final. Don't miss that. Saul didn't become Paul because he cleaned his act up. Saul became Paul because he surrendered himself to Jesus. His failure wasn't final because of his determination. It wasn't final because of his faith. Can I ask you this morning, what are you placing your faith in? Is it money? Students, is it in your friendships? What are you placing your faith in? Is it in your own effort, in your own ability? You see, at his lowest, you know what Saul chose to place his faith in? Jesus. And here's what I know. When we bring our failure to Jesus, we're able to let failure drive us forward. This is my final point, is this: let failure drive you forward. After Saul regains his sight, look at what he immediately starts doing. It's amazing. 19 and 20. Saul spent several days with the disciples in Damascus. At once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. What did Saul do? He let his failure drive him forward. How many letters did Paul write? How many churches did he plant? How many journeys did he take to spread the gospel? Come on, name somebody with a greater legacy whose name isn't Jesus. Name somebody who has had a greater impact on spreading the faith. And I want you to see this, that all of his greatest feats came after his failure, because Saul let his failures drive him forward. I realize that this is much easier said than done. This is easier to preach, harder to live. I understand that, but I want to encourage you. Can I do that this morning? Own your failure, but don't let it own you. I want to say it again. Own your failure. Too often we allow our failures to become our face.